Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. Happy to come talk to you guys about.
Oh man,
It's too tall.
Hold it. Okay. That better? Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here to talk to you guys about common liability risks. Some of the more common types of claims that we get under the liability self-insurance plan, ways that RMs can help mitigate those risks to prevent claims happening, and ways that RMs can help us defend them in liability claims both before and after claims are made. So the first type of claim I'll talk about today are flooding claims. Flooding claims are currently the most common type of litigation claim that we are dealing with, mostly dating back to the wet years in the past decade. So historically, claims for damages caused by flooding were either brought for claims in nuisance or brought as claims under Section 58 of the Water Security Agency Act. But now, because the Municipalities Act prohibits claims in nuisance against municipalities, claims can only be brought against RMs for flooding either in negligence or under Section 58 of the Water Security Agency Act. And a claim under Section 58 of the Water Security Agency Act is essentially saying that someone has, without a permit from the Water Security Agency, done something to divert surface water off of their property. So in claims against RMs, the diversion of water usually occurs, or at least is alleged to have occurred, because of one of three things. The RM having failed to provide adequate drainage facilities through a municipal road, the RM having failed to properly maintain existing drainage facilities, or the RM having breached a road or beaver dam during a flooding event resulting in water going places that it otherwise wouldn't have gone. So what can we do to mitigate and minimize the risk of some of these things? Well, first of all, ensuring adequate drainage facilities are in place. So whenever you're carrying out activities to upgrade or reconstruct your roads, seek expert advice on what drainage facilities are required. Because what is required isn't always obvious. Experts can assist by identifying what area drains into a particular crossing, what the anticipated peak flows might be, the duration and frequency of those flows, and what size of culvert is required to pass those flows. Consideration should also be given to what, if any, structures are located upstream of a particular crossing, and what impacts temporary flooding might have, and if those structures can withstand that temporary flooding. Ensuring that drainage facilities are unobstructed. Periodically, municipalities should inspect their drainage facilities to ensure they are unobstructed. And the courts have said that it's simply not good enough to do that when complaints are received or if flooding's already occurring. The courts are expecting through the rulings over the years that municipalities should be more proactive in this regard. So it may be necessary to take steps to clear culverts regularly, especially in the spring when high flows can be expected. And finally, consider the impacts before breaching a road or a beaver dam. In emergency situations, it's best to think carefully before doing anything that could be viewed as altering the natural drainage of a particular area. Seeking expert advice in this regard can be really helpful. Frequently, claims have arisen because the RM has either cut a road or breached a beaver dam during a flood event, usually to alleviate flooding upstream of a situation. And this action is usually very well justified. However, the impacts downstream have to be taken into account, and if measures can be taken to prevent or minimize flooding downstream of that, they should be looked into and taken where reasonable. Another really common type of claim that we see in the plan are claims in trespass. We get a number of these every year, and they typically involve the removal of trees or other damage to land, typically because of road construction, clearing of sight lines, and occasionally even from snow ridging. So to trespass means to enter upon the land of another without lawful jurisdiction, or justification, sorry. Trespass involves a direct interference with another's use or enjoyment of their own land, and that's contrasted with nuisance, where that's when you using your own land in such a way to cause a reduction in someone else's use or enjoyment of their land. So lawful justification to enter one's land can come about in several ways. Having the consent of the person who owns the land is the most obvious, and another is that you have the statutory authority to do so. I should caution that you should really exercise caution when relying on the statutory authority to enter another person's land. Courts have and continue to construe this authority given to you to do work on private land without the owner's consent very narrowly. So if there's ever any doubt as to whether you have the legal authority to do something on someone's private land, it's better to err on the side of caution and seek the permission in advance of doing that work. So what can be done to avoid trespassing claims? Most important thing would be get consent in writing and make sure it's from the right person. If you need to go on the land for a temporary period of time and the impact of the land is very minimal, oftentimes it will suffice to get the permission of the occupier of the land and not necessarily the owner. However, if there are going to be more permanent effects or a more prolonged period of time where you're accessing land, it may be important, quite important, to get the permission of the owner. And it's easy enough to check title, and we can even assist with that to make sure you're dealing with the right parties. And when you're seeking that consent from the landowners, always be really clear and upfront as to what you're proposing to do on their land and the extent of any impacts of that work. Be aware of any unusual conditions on the land, and get the owners, put the onus on the owner or occupant of the land to draw the arm's attention to any unusual or hazardous situations that they might come across when being on the land. And most importantly, know where the property line is. Particularly when you're doing work near a shelter belt, it's really important to mark out the location of the property line. And obviously doing a survey is the clearest way to do that, but that's a very expensive way to go about it. So if you can work with the owner to agree on where the property line is, even if that's later disputed by the owner, you've at least got something saying that they had agreed that this is where the property line is, and they've essentially stopped themselves from making a claim against the RM down the road. Road claims are the most common type of claim and the most frequent type of claim we receive in the liability self-insurance plan. And this isn't surprising because maintenance of roads is your single biggest responsibility as a council. Looking at the history of the plan, there are several conditions which have given rise to these claims, and they include the failure to sign hazardous conditions such as a T-intersection, a sharp curve, or a hidden intersection. The failure to alert motorists to temporary conditions such as soft spots or washouts, or, and this is the most common one, is claims based on the presence of rocks or other foreign hazards on the road. So what is the RM's duty of care with respect to roads? Well, the starting point for the RM's duty when it comes to roads is Section 343 of the Municipalities Act, which says that every council should keep their roads in a reasonable state of repair. And a municipal road is a public highway, which is under the direction, management, and control of the RM, as per Section 12 of the Municipalities Act. And this encompasses all public roads in your RM, except for those designated as provincial highways. It's important to note that the term public highway is defined to include not only the actual roadway, but also the entire road allowance, as well as any additional right-of-way that has been required for that purpose. However, the duty of care does not extend to roads which have been permanently or temporarily closed, or road allowances which have not been developed. And the scope of your duty is further limited by Section 345, subclause B of the Act that says that the municipality is not liable for damage caused essentially off of the traveled portion of the road. It gets really long. It says not liable for any damage caused by or account of any construction, obstruction, erection, or any situation, arrangement, or disposition of any earth, tree, rock, or other material or thing adjacent to or in, along, or on a street, road, or that is not on the traveled portion of said street or road. So essentially, your liability extends while you are liable, or you're responsible to keep the entire roadway in a reasonable state of repair. You're essentially only liable for the traveled portion of the road. Now, having said that, if there is a known hazard on the not traveled portion of the road and it can be reasonably and inexpensively dealt with, we'd always recommend that you do that, because it can still cause hazard to people using snowmobiles or quads or whatever like that. Now, as to the civil law consequences of a breach of duty, Section 343 of the Act also provides the answer to that. And it says that if a municipality fails to perform its duty, it is liable for any resulting damages. So 343 provides, not only imposes the duty on a municipality, but goes on to prescribe the consequences of the breach, which is essentially that if there is a breach, the RM is found to be negligent. So what is the standard of care that an RM owes to the traveling public? And how do you meet this obligation? So the Act says to keep your roads in a reasonable state of repair. In determining that, regard has to be had to the character of the road and its location within the municipality. And it also goes on to state that the road will be considered in a reasonable state of repair if those using the road can do so with safety when they're exercising ordinary caution. So liability is essentially only imposed on a municipality where the condition complained of could be characterized as an unusual hazard or a trap, or if it's said to pose an unreasonable risk of harm to the traveling public. And this reflects the reality of driving, that hazards are inherent and regularly encountered and even expected by motorists. Potential hazards are constantly evaluated by competent motorists, and their driving patterns are adjusted accordingly. So to put it another way, simply because a hazard exists on a road doesn't necessarily mean that the road is in a state of disrepair. And the risk of harm which it poses to motorists exercising ordinary care can be assessed. And so it's only when there's an unreasonable risk or state of harm to a municipality, to a driver exercising ordinary care, that an RM could be found to have breached their duty. So there's several factors which we look at when assessing a claim that comes to us, and which mimics what courts would look at for municipalities if a claim was ever escalated to that level. And these include the type or class of road, so the level of service expected on a road which services a regional park is different from that of a road which services a land access. Traffic volumes on the road, the class of the road, the means at the RM's disposal. Courts often look at the number of roads that a municipality is responsible to look after and the financial means at their availability. Of course, this shouldn't, the courts will look at this only narrowly, because they have said there's a range of options often available to address a particular hazard on a road. And if the cheapest option was within the municipality's means, in the court's opinion, they will have felt that that should have been accomplished. And lastly, the last condition to take into account is weather. Roads might not be passable in all conditions. In fact, lots of roads in RMs aren't passable at all during the winter months. So drivers have to adjust their condition not only to the driving, to the weather conditions as well. And another component to this is signage. So taken narrowly, it could be said that the duty to keep a road in a reasonable state of repair would focus on the road itself, but courts have said that the duty of repair expands to include signage, and they've said that the duty, together with the standard of care, requires that warning signs be maintained, warning of hazards that prudent drivers exercising ordinary care would be unlikely to appreciate. So in determining whether an RM has met the required standard of care in any case, the courts are permitted to consider evidence as to any relevant custom, industry practice, and statutory or regulatory standards. So this means that courts regularly look at information provided by provincial government agencies such as the Ministry of Highways, or the Transportation Association of Canada and its Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or an example closer to home would be the sign manual, which has been developed by the Ministry of Highways and SARM. And this can provide a wealth of information as to what signage can be placed on a road to cover off a myriad of different situations. Now, the signage standards or guidelines are not conclusive in any claim, but they go to the question of whether the municipality has met the standard of care by having the appropriate signage in place. Now, sometimes it's questioned If there's any degree on the part of if there's any degree of negligence on the part of a driver in a claim, that would preclude all liability on the RM. But courts have said that that's not the case. While one driver may contribute to his or her own risk of harm, other drivers exercising ordinary care would still have been put at an unreasonable risk of harm by the same hazard present on a road. So it's been said that, from a court case recently, it says that whenever a driver at large exercising ordinary care for his or her own safety is exposed to an unreasonable risk of harm, a state of disrepair may be said to exist regardless of the conduct of the particular driver. And the municipality will be at fault, at least in part, depending on whether the driver was also at fault. But even if a road is in a state of disrepair, it does not necessarily follow that RMs will be liable. And in fact, while cases for road issues, particularly rocks on roads or other foreign hazards on roads, is our #1 frequency of claim. It is near the bottom of the list in terms of claims that we have actually paid over the past 32 years that the plan has been in operation. We typically have paid somewhere around 20% of the claims that we've ever received for road hazards, because in often cases, municipalities, we find, weren't aware of a particular hazard, nor should they have been reasonably expected to be aware of a particular hazard. There's hundreds of kilometers of roads under your jurisdiction, and things regularly fall off passing vehicles or other ways that debris or other things end up on the road, and it's not reasonable for the municipality to have been on every kilometer of every road every minute of the day. And so, but the Act recognizes this, and so Section 343, sub 7 of the Municipalities Act it says exactly that the municipality is only liable if the municipality knew or should have known of this disrepair or hazard. And so, of course, if the plaintiff can prove that the condition complained of was the municipality was aware of, it's easy to find liability. But more cases are not, the municipality didn't know and reasonably shouldn't have known, so it becomes a little more tricky. So, courts have had tests on claims that make it to that level, and said the courts focus on whether the condition complained of was a common occurrence on a road, what system municipalities had in place to check for hazards on roads, and whether those systems were being followed. And in our experience, municipalities do a very good job of maintaining the roads. Councils are checking roads, your employees are checking the roads when they're grading and doing other things on the roads. And so it's, I have found in my time working with the plan and my predecessors have found the same thing, that having those good records that you guys keep about your road maintenance really helps us be able to defend the municipalities against these claims. And so what can municipalities do to avoid claims for road repair? It comes down to being proactive and in dealing with potential hazards on the roads. Regular inspections, not only of the road surfaces, but also of the signs that are on the road, making sure that any signs that are up stay up. And I know signs go missing all the time, or they get knocked down, and it's just a matter of keeping those inspections in place to check to make sure that the signs are supposed to be up or there, and that the roads are being checked on a regular basis. And when it comes to what you do to avoid claims for around signage, if you're ever in doubt, check the sign manual that I talked about, that was developed by SARM and the Ministry of Highways. It's a wealth of knowledge about different scenarios, and even at the office, Terry Hoving at our office is a wealth of information around signage, and we're always more than happy to help you guys out if there's ever a question about what sign should be in a certain place. One note about signs to be cautioned is when you're driving your roads and giving some thought to what signs might be there, you're all familiar with your roads, but it's important to look at the roads from the perspective of someone who's not at all familiar with them when you're considering what signage you might need in a situation, because that's what ultimately the courts would consider is, should there have been a sign for a reasonable driver unfamiliar with the territory. So always try to keep that in mind when you're assessing what sort of signs might be needed in a situation as someone who's not at all familiar with the territory. When it comes to claims for failing to alert motorists of temporary conditions like washouts and soft spots, again here the key is the key is inspections, and when you do become aware of things, flagging and closing roads. And the same thing for hazards, as I talked about. So another category where we continue to experience claims on an annual basis is claims to do with the operation of municipal equipment. So this includes collisions with other vehicles or trains, cutting of underground cables or lines, damage to overhead lines, and most frequently rocks being thrown from equipment such as mowers or snow plows or snow blowers. Now, usually these claims are fairly minor, involving just property damage, but sometimes they can be more significant. Thinking back, there was a major one 6 or 7 years ago up north where there was a grader train collision that was a terrible incident. And what can be done to avoid or mitigate the risk of claims that will inevitably happen with municipal equipment? And the key here is to recognize the risk of familiarity. It's human nature to become desensitized to the potential risks of what we do on a daily basis. When we repeatedly do the same things day in and day out and never experience any consequences or any incidents pop up while we do it, we become more and more desensitized to the risks of what we really do every day. And this can be significant when operating equipment, particularly around intersections, train crossings, above or below ground infrastructure such as power or gas lines. So it's important to remind your operators regularly of the risks of the tasks they perform, and also identify the potential risks and help develop practices to safeguard workers from those risks that they face. For example, it can be helpful in the wintertime to open the window of a grader when you're working near a train crossing, because the noise from the engine and the fan and the heater can all drown out the noise of a horn of an approaching train. And the last type of claim that we see occasionally, but certainly it's more of a risk potential for the plan and for municipalities, is around building inspections. Claims that are arising out of the alleged negligence in the enforcement and administration of building standards have been relatively few over the years, but they can be very costly to defend and to settle, and they have a lot of potential to be a significant claim. So I thought it would be useful to review what the duties of the municipality are with respect to the enforcement and administration of building standards. And in this regard, reference should be made to the Uniform Building and Accessibility Standards Act, and in particular to Section 7 of the Act, which requires that all buildings in the province be designed and constructed in accordance with building standards. And by regulation, the province has adopted the standards as set out in the National Building Code of Canada 2015. So while the primary responsibility to ensure buildings are constructed to code lies with the owner and or builder of a building, Section 4 of the Act imposes on local authorities the legal obligation to enforce and administer building standards, the Act and the regulations. And this provision has given rise to a significant liability exposure to municipalities in recent years. So to explain a little bit more, while the Act does not say what the civil law consequences would be of a failure to administer and enforce the Building Standards Act, courts have said that if a municipality is negligent in the performance of its duty in this regard, it will be civilly liable to anyone who sustains damage as a result. And this duty not only extends to the owner of the building, but also any subsequent owners of the building, occupiers, neighbors, and indeed anybody who could suffer damages. So what precisely should you as municipalities do to administer and enforce the Act? Well, that's going to vary depending on the amount of building construction going on in your municipality and whether it falls under the Act and its regulations. At a minimum, it would be our recommendation that having a building bylaw which sets up a building permit system is important. Enforcement of the Act and its regulations would be very difficult without a system in place whereby people have to let you know that they're intending to build and whether that building falls under the Act. And in addition, you probably would need to appoint a building inspector who can perform plan reviews, site inspections, and enforcement functions for you. And whether you're employing such an individual or contracting with a firm that does this work would, again, depend on the amount of activity in your municipality that falls under the Act. And in that regard, it's important to understand what does and does not fall under the Act and its regulations. In general, the rule is all buildings in the province are supposed to be designed and constructed in accordance with the code. but there are some exceptions, and the most important and significant of this for rural municipal operations is the exemption for farm buildings. Now, farm buildings are defined for the purpose of the Act to mean a building associated with a farming operation. It includes a residence consisting of not more than 2 dwelling units, but does not include buildings associated with commercial operations, multiple occupancy residences, or assembly buildings. So what is required for a municipality to meet the requisite standard of care? Well, when someone applies for a building permit, the building official is expected to review plans to see if what is being proposed will meet code. And thus a fair bit of information is required. And if not, the application can be rejected for insufficient information. And during construction, building officials should be permitted to inspect buildings at certain key times, such as when the foundation is being completed, framing, and final. It's important to note the mere fact that a builder or owner fails to notify a municipality or a building inspector that the building is being built does not get municipalities off the hook. A building inspector has extensive powers under the Act, which include the power to order that the owner of a building satisfy the building inspector that its codes are being met. And these powers can and need to be utilized. Several claims we have had over the years in this regard could have been avoided had building officials utilize these powers to enforce the code. And just how far your inspector should go will depend on the circumstances, including the gravity of any potential harm of a deficiency, previous experience that the inspector has had with this builder, and the cost of the measures to determine if the code is being met. But the bottom line is, if the work is in question is important, and if it's feasible to inspect, it's important to carry out those inspections. And so I'll wrap up today. I have no idea where I'm at for time. Kelsey say I'm okay. What can municipalities do to assist us in defending municipalities for claims under our liability self-insurance plan? The key thing here is keeping good records of your operations, whether you're talking about road construction, maintenance, or culvert inspections, or anything in that regard. Good records help us help you guys to defend you guys against claims that are brought by other people. The absence of records can equally be as much of a problem in defending a claim where there isn't good records to rely upon. Now, with respect to road construction, keeping good records on when roads are graded, who did them and when roads were graveled, when roads were inspected, who inspected them, what were they inspecting for, if there was something specific. If there's been any complaints about a road, it's important to keep those in place. Oftentimes we argue that the lack of complaints about an issue on a road is indication that there wasn't really an issue with the road. But again, the lack of tracking of complaints can be a hindrance to that defense. Keeping track of all the signs on your roads, having a sign map talking about all the different signs and where they're located in the municipality can be really helpful when you're checking to see if signs are missing or not. And also tracking things like accidents where roads may have been a factor. And if you receive a claim, there are certain things you can do to help us. Again, if your municipality is in our self-insurance plan, and regardless, notify your insurer as soon as possible when you have a claim. If you're in the liability self-insurance plan, that would be me. And send us the notice of claim, the summons, the statement of claim from the Queen's Bench Court. And if you're aware of a situation that might give rise to a claim, feel free to contact your insurer and put them on notice that there might be the potential one. It's helpful to know in advance to prepare if there's something coming down the pipeline. Gathering relevant information, supplying it to your insurer is really helpful. Preserving evidence, especially if there's a chance that evidence might disappear or change. If you're talking about an incident on a road, taking photographs as soon as possible so that is documented what it looked like at the time of the incident. And it's very important to never make any voluntary admissions that the RM is or might be liable, or even express any opinion in that regard. Statements like that can be looked at in a negative light by the courts, and it can be a hindrance to a defense. But if you just say, we're just going to hand this claim off to our insurer and they'll be in contact with you, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say to a claimant who's trying to make a demand of the municipality. And I think that's about all I've got. I've probably put you all to sleep. But I look forward to the roundtables with you guys and answering any questions you might have about liability insurance or indeed any of our insurance and benefit programs that we offer.